I'm Jess Lenore for the Real News Network. We're here at the B&O Railroad Museum on the 140th anniversary of the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. I'm here with labor historian Bill Berry, who wrote a wonderful book about the railroad strike. So we're here at this exhibit the museum has created about the railroad strike, and we're going to get a quick guided tour through this exhibit with Bill. But first of all, Bill, most people have not heard about the railroad strike.
That's right.
Today. It happened 140 years ago. It started right here in Baltimore in Camden Yards. More than 100,000 workers participated. Mm-hmm. They had to call in almost half the army to put it down. 10 people were killed right here in Baltimore. Hundreds more were injured around the country. It was called an insurrection. It was called a riot, a revolution. So talk about this really important seminal moment in history.
What got me started was, if you look at Camden Yards, the state put up a historical marker there to commemorate the strike. And one of the things I think is very important is that workers need to know their own history, because it's a guide to tomorrow. And it also needs to be done in a way that anybody can understand it. A lot of histories, you have to have 12 years of graduate school to get through the first 2 pages. And so, as a union organizer and a labor historian, I just thought this was a great moment. And when we put the historical marker up, I was surprised and disappointed how few people actually knew about the history of the strike. So I said,
it's not taught in history books. It's not talked about today at all. In textbooks.
That's right. And many of the textbooks are incorrect in that it started in Martinsburg, West Virginia, when in fact it started right at Camden Yards. In a time of small businesses and workshops, the railroad was the first national industry, employed tens of thousands of people, both on the construction of the railroads and on the railroad operating itself. And there's a whole history of labor disputes on the construction of the railroads, Irish families living in tents and shanties along the rails as they went from the east to the west. We're more familiar with the stories of the Chinese laborers moving from the west to the east. But it was a huge industry. John Garrett became the president in 1855, an incredibly wealthy man and a really dynamic visionary who saw the future as railroads, and began to move so that the B&O went as far as Chicago, but was linked to nationwide railroads. And what you see here, though, is he took advantage what Naomi Klein calls the shock doctrine. And when the Depression of 1873 hit, he and a lot of the other railroad owners used that as an opportunity to cut wages. So what provoked the strike was the second 10% wage cut. And you will see.
And this is a time when the railroad was making
money. Well, they were cutting back. There were some problems with the Depression, but he never cut executive salaries, never dropped a 10% dividend to the stockholders, but began to cut people, put them on short weeks, all sorts of different events. But the minutes of the board meeting, which are up here, and we have copies of it, the week before he said we're going to have a 10% pay cut, and we assure our employees will cheerfully concur with our decision. And he was so confident that the workers would take it that they canceled their monthly board meetings for the rest of the summer so they could all go away. So the following Monday, the 16th of July, workers went down to Camden Yards to get paid and get their assignments, and they were told the 10% cut was in effect, and they said, we're not working. And that started it, and it spread all across the country, went to Martinsburg, went to Chicago, went to Pittsburgh, went to San Francisco, and dozens of small rail lines along the way. And it involved the strikers, their families. An interesting group that was involved were the militia, and the militia were the equivalent to the National Guard. And they were workers, relatives of strikers, friends who were looking for a second job. And I just have a newspaper article in the other room about how a militia was disbanded for fraternizing with the strikers. Mm-hmm. But what we saw here was the last Friday, first Friday of the strike, the 20th, the militia was sent to Frostburg, and they tried to march from their armories down. And as the armory in the west side by the shot tower, militia left there, people coming home from work started stoning them and yelling at them, and they shot and killed 10 people, none of whom was involved in the strike, right by City Hall on Holiday Street. Subsequently, then, the President of the United States sent the Army in and crushed the strike. And what you see here are Gatling machine gun companies. Mm-hmm. This is the Gatling letter, and I found that in the archives as a miracle a number of years ago, and I can give you a copy of that. I have true copies of that I can send you. But we'd heard about that.
So actual, like, large-scale machine guns were brought into Camden
Yes,
Yards?
yes. And the Gatling Machine Gun Company president is apologizing because he can't supply enough Gatling guns. You can see here in that drawing here where the Gatling guns are. They're being brought in from Fort McHenry. And there are other pictures that are in the book of machine guns around, blocking the people off from, here's the original Camden Yards, and people will recognize that obviously as the entrance to the stadium. The strike then went to Pittsburgh. They had a huge event the Sunday night of the strike where the militia was sent. One of the tricks that the railroad companies did was to send militia to the opposite end of the state so they wouldn't know anybody. And so the militia was sent to Pittsburgh, was from Philadelphia. And they were pushed into the roundhouse. And you have to remember that many of the people on both the strikers and in the militia had been in the Civil War. So they knew military tactics. They got the Pittsburgh, Philadelphia militia in the roundhouse. They then got cars of fuel oil, set them on fire, and rolled them into the roundhouse. So you see here, this is a Pittsburgh damage report. And the militia then came out.
So I'm reading it. It says 39 buildings, 104 locomotives, 1,200 rail cars were destroyed.
Yep, by an enormous fire. Well, the Thursday night of the strike here, the Friday night after the people were killed, there was a wooden building outside Camden Yards, which was used as a telegraph office, and the strikers burned that. And you can see that picture here. Now, one of the things that's important in how the strike is portrayed, and this is a picture from Alan Pinkerton. And Alan Pinkerton started the first company spy company.
The Pinkertons, which a lot of people
Right. And his logo was a huge eye, and his motto was, "This eye never sleeps," and that was the origin of the term private eye. But he had just finished, before the strike, killing 11 people in Pennsylvania because he infiltrated the union group up there called the Molly Maguires. And so in June, it was called the Day of the Rope, and 10 of them were hung in Pottstown, a week before the strike started. But if you look at this drawing, which was in his magazine and in his book, the women, Irish women, are portrayed like monkeys. You see the underslung jaw and the big teeth, and that's consistent with how he portrayed immigrant workers, as almost ape-like.
And this section talks about how the police were used to put down the strike. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, the police had mixed feelings about the strike. The police chief, you'll see in the slideshow, put out a curfew notice and tried to clear the streets, but the police were related to strikers and their families. It was a regular working class job. The strike really was not broken until John Garrett, the president of the B&O, contacted Rutherford B. Hayes, president of the United States, said, "Send me federal troops." And
this section over here deals
with
that.
Yes. And they were sent in then from Fort McHenry. And if you remember your history, Rutherford B. Hayes was elected in 1877 in a contested election, got the votes of southern states by promising to withdraw all federal troops from the states. And basically that turned the South back over to the plantation owners and the white supremacists.
Which ended Reconstruction.
Which ended Reconstruction, exactly. But the promise was no federal troops in the states. He hadn't been in office 2 months when he brought federal troops into Baltimore City to break the strike. And you'll see in his diary a concern about, gee, we need to find a better thing. The whole question of industrial policy and the position of workers and what should the government do was all new at this time. People were just starting to figure it out, because this was the first large industry. And in the years to come on the railroads, there were major strikes. The Knights of Labor had in the 1880s, the Pullman strike in 1894. And to be fair, the first national labor legislation, the Railway Labor Act, was passed in 1924, was really the result of this strike. It was that pressure by the workers and their willingness to sacrifice and willingness to struggle that finally got a law passed that gave them some protection. But what you see here are the armories with the weapons. These are just Springfield rifles. These are left over from the Civil War and a new standard issue. And one of the things that was interesting was there was a debate in the country at the time about whether we even need an army. And the army had not been paid for 3 months because there were people who said, we don't need an army. It's the civic duty of everybody to go into the militia. And William Tecumseh Sherman was one who publicly advocated for a large standing army. And this kind of tipped the balance in the favor of the larger standing army.
Can you talk about some of the scenes that were...
Well, these are the scenes of the armory marching up here, this large one here, the 6th Regiment. Their armory was over by what is the shot tower, by the post office in East Baltimore. And they were called out, and the guys had to march down a narrow stairway. The streets were being paved. It was a time, it's 5:30 or 6 o'clock, when people were just coming home from work. The mayor rang the bell at City Hall. It was called Big Sam, which only rings in times of an emergency. So people gathered. They started throwing rocks at the strikers, at the militia, and demonstrating against them. And what you see here then is the militia shooting people down by City Hall. And as I said, there were 10 innocent people, including a 14-year-old newsboy supporting his widowed mother. Another guy whose brother was in the militia, he'd got up on a lamppost to ask, where's my brother? Well, I better get out of here. And he turned around to go, and he got shot through the back of the neck.
What were the strikers armed with?
Nothing. These were paving bricks that were, I wouldn't probably call these weapons as the strikers. They were stones that were left in Pratt Street that were being used to repave the streets. This is the thing about Richard Zepp, who was a strike leader in Martinsburg. His grandniece lives in Northeast Baltimore City, Grace Barnes, and I hope she will be here today. George Zepp, the brother, her grandfather, was also involved in the strike, but as a scab. Richard was a leader. But you'll see in Martinsburg, the mayor was a railroad worker, all the militia were railroad workers. And so they said, arrest Richard Zepp. And so they did, and then he said, well, Richard needs to eat first. So they let him go in a restaurant, and then he went out the back door, and basically nobody ever bothered him. But it was a great, great discussion.
And in your book, when you were talking about the power of community in the railroad, you talk about a railroad leader who, or a scab who was going to go operate a train, but his wife and his daughter
got up and begged them. That was George Zepp.
Oh, that was George Zepp.
Yeah.
Okay. But
it's a famous Zepp family, and there's now a museum in Martinsburg which memorializes them. But I had a wonderful discussion with his granddaughter, and she has memories of the grandfather a little bit, and some stuff from the strike, but not much. She's as sharp at 94 as you are, sharper probably than I am, but it's wonderful. So this exhibit will be up until next year.
Okay.
So people who want to come can come, and it's a great, great exhibit.
All right, and Bill, as you were helping put together today's activities and events, we talked to some of the railroad workers and some of the union leaders, talking about how some of the conditions, some of the things they're fighting for have parallels and roots in the strike that happened 140 years ago. But you talk about this moment in as far as labor, organized labor goes, as the fight for workers' rights. Talk about why it's important to have this memory of what the power of workers today.
If you see my slideshow, you'll see the first slide is history is a guide for tomorrow. And I often will say, as I will say today and often, that when people who are religious have tough times, they read the Bible. When I have tough times, I read labor history, because it shows the determination and the spirit of people who said, I'm not satisfied with what I have. And we need to find that now. And the anger of the people who voted for Donald Trump, for example, needs to be channeled. You get angry at the wealthy people, and then you vote for one. It just is inconsistent.